BCFM 93.2.
Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, sound check. Check 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 9 8 7 6 5 4 3 2 1. Broadcasting for the most confused, dumbed down, manipulated, and brainwashed nation on the face of the planet with the news they hope and pray you never hear.
The Charlottesville business in the US. We've got to recognise that the deep state in the US is encouraging social conflict both in the US and elsewhere, and that we shouldn't take at face value exactly what's going on here. There's quite possibility. There's a possibility that both sides are being infiltrated and manipulated. So, for example, one of the organisers of the right-wing protest about the Robert E. Lee statue was actually a part of the Occupy movement some years ago, and he seems to have completely changed his spots and gone to the other side.
There's suggestions by Susan Lindauer that he's an agent provocateur.
Well, that may be the case. There may be agent provocateurs operating within both groups, and that would fit the pattern of what we know about how NATO intelligence services operate.
So, first of all, what is an agent provocateur?
Well, an agent provocateur is somebody who joins a political group in order to try and basically make them do more extreme things, so that they can then be, blamed, rounded up, neutralised, etc. So, in the past, there was a book called "What Everybody Should Know About State Repression," which was written by a Russian called. I've forgotten the name now, but people can look it up. And of course, one of the things that everybody should know about state repression is that the state infiltrates people into groups in order to encourage bad behaviour, which they can then use against the groups concerned and the causes that they're pursuing. And we've got to remember that we now know that the British police force, for example, since 1968, the Special Demonstration Squad has got hundreds of members, and they were busily infiltrating lots of groups. So people say this doesn't go on. We've got evidence that it does, and we know it does.
This book you're talking about is by Victor Serge.
That's right, Victor Serge.
The Secrets of Provocation. It says the recruitment and operation of agent provocateurs, external surveillance being followed, and problems of illegality. Yeah,
it was written in the early part of the 20th century. And he also wrote a book about the Russian Revolution, in which he participated, called Birth of Our Power. And he's
1979.
Well, that's maybe when it was published, but it was written a long time before that, I think.
Well, not according to this. First edition, 1979. But anyhow,
right.
So what about the wider issues to do with Charlottesville? Because this is all about statues and about pulling down statues. Now, there is a sort of similar talk in Bristol, isn't there, in a kind of here and there, about the statue of Edward Colston, this kind of thing. And, of course, we've seen this time and time again. Statue of Gaddafi pulled down, statue of Saddam Hussein pulled down. It seems that this is something that's supposedly incredibly important about this. I mean, a lot of people will look at a statue and say, so what?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is what's happened in Richmond, Virginia, is that the local council, in its wisdom, has decided that it doesn't want the statue there anymore, and they don't want the park to be called the Park Lee anymore. They want it to be called Emancipation Park, and that was because of agitations by people on the left at the University of Virginia and within that community of Charlottesville.
This goes back to the 1840s, 1850s.
Well, no, in actual fact, most of these Confederate statues of Confederate generals and politicians went up in the 1920s.
No, but what about the actual why they're there?
No,
what we're referencing.
Let me just explain to you, Tony.
War, yeah.
Let me just explain to you. After the Civil War, the defeated Confederacy was not allowed to put statues up of the people that had fought for the Confederacy. In fact, people in the North would have gone bonkers if a Robert E. Lee statue had gone up. Don't forget, we've just smashed completely the Confederacy. You've had to free the slaves.
It's a little bit like, say, in the 1950s, putting up an Adolf Hitler
Exactly. So, in other words, these statues do not date back to that era, because in that era they would have been so controversial that nobody would have dared to put them up. They were mostly put up in the 1920s when a resurgent right-wing racist movement in the South wanted to reclaim the Confederate history of the South. And at that time, they managed to put these statues up, even though they wouldn't have been allowed to put them up previously. And now, of course, the pendulum's swinging in the other direction, and people are saying, well, what are these statues doing here. They represent slavery, they represent oppression. They went up in the 1920s when many blacks were still denied the vote in this part of the world, and so on. So in other words, it's a symbolic battle between the left and the right. But in Richmond itself, the local councillors decided, as a local councillor is perfectly entitled to do, to take the statue away and to change the name of the park. Now, some people may not like that, but then ultimately the decision about statues is a decision for local councils, and it's a planning decision. And ultimately, we might decide in this city, through our collective wisdom, to remove the statue of Colston, or we might not. But the point is that it's our decision to make either way. And you can't just say statues that are there have always got to stay there. What about all the statues of Lenin all over Eastern Europe? There must have been thousands and thousands of them. Are they all supposed to stay there forever?
Let's get back to the Civil War, though, which is where a lot of these sentiments begin.
Yeah.
Was it really just about slavery?
No, it wasn't. It was about a number of different issues. But the point...
I mean, it was basically the Confederate states were the slave states.
Yes.
They were really slavery, I suppose you could sum it up in... businessmen, landowners, etc., that didn't really want to pay any wages at all for cheap labour. They just wanted to have slaves instead, and they didn't want to give them up.
Yes, and many people in the North felt that was unfair competition for people who weren't slaves. So that was one of the reasons why, the relatively quite racist people of the time didn't like slavery in the South, because they thought it was undercutting their own wages, which of course it was.
And how long did it go for? And how long?
Well, it started when the English first arrived in North America in the 1600s, and it gradually became more and more important. That once the thing that made slavery really important was the discovery that tobacco could be grown, and ultimately cotton could be grown, and that became incredibly profitable. But you can only really grow those crops with a huge workforce, and that workforce had to come from somewhere. They were brought in from Africa, and it became a very profitable, very successful setup. You were then in a situation where the vested interests involved did not want to see that changed under any circumstances.
But what do you make about this whole thing of taking down statues? Is that a good idea, or is it just something that should be decided by governments?
It should be decided.
The thing is, of course, I mean, for example, in the English Civil War, we had Charles I's head chopped off, and yet I think in a way quite sensibly didn't take down all the statues of Charles I. In fact, there's a very famous one.
In actual fact,
just a minute, let me finish my sentence. There's a very famous one outside Charing Cross Station.
Well, in the Commonwealth, when Cromwell was in charge, no statues of King Charles were put up. And of course, what eventually happened is the Royalists reasserted themselves, and at that point, those statues were safe. But the question of what statues should or shouldn't be there is a decision for local communities.
A little story about that statue of King Charles I. After the parliamentary victory in the English Civil War, the statue was sold to a metalsmith in the Holborn area called John Rivet. Rivet received instructions from Parliament to break down the statue, but instead he hid it on his premises. It is said he buried it. He produced some broken pieces of brass as evidence that he followed his instructions. And for some time, sold brass-handled cutlery to both royalists and parliamentarians, which he claimed was made from the remains of the statue. But after the Restoration, the statue was found by Jerome Weston, the 2nd Earl of Portland. Following a complaint to the House of Lords, it was decreed the said John Rivet shall permit and suffer the Sheriff of London to serve a replevin, whatever that is, upon the said statue, now in his custody. It was purchased by the King, 1675, placed outside Charing Cross Station. So, it really is about this history being written by the winners, isn't it, effectively?
Yes.
And it was only because of the Restoration that statue got put back.
That's right. Well, I think, would people be happy to have statues of Stalin around Britain? No, they probably wouldn't. So you've got to,
Stalin, wasn't it Stalin that pretty much won the Second World War?
Well, yes, and you might argue that we should have statues of him. But, I mean, the point is, you've got masses and masses of statues in central London of various Victorian generals who all they really did was go and basically rape and pillage around the world. And ultimately, you've got to make a decision: do you want those statues to stay? You don't necessarily have to destroy the statues. I mean, there's a museum at Kozłówka near Lubartów in Poland, and it's basically a stately home, but one of the barns near it has been absolutely filled up with statues from the communist era in Poland. But they're not there in the central square anymore, because having the central square dominated by communist statues was just not the mood of the moment in the 1990s when Poland became a democracy. And therefore, you've got to allow the possibility that there's going to be a change in street furniture. You know, you're not necessarily going to have the same statues today as you had yesterday, and it's a question of for local decision makers to make.
Well, okay, let's bring this back to Colston and Thomas Clarkson. It was the famous abolitionist who started the committee in Bristol, which finally did get the slave trade, at least the official slave trade anyway, abolished. So why is there no statue to him?
Well, because there's inevitably a bias in statues towards the dominant political interests in the society. They're the ones who've got the resources and the clout.
Surely the dominant interest after the abolition was that.
Well, no, the dominant interest remained. I mean, don't forget that the people who owned slaves were all compensated, given full compensation for their slaves, which were freed in Jamaica and elsewhere, and that was then paid for by taxes on tobacco and booze, which were paid for by white people in Britain. And so, in actual fact, there are loads of families, like the Gladstone family, started their whole career as entrepreneurs in the Industrial Revolution on the back of a big handout for all the slaves themselves didn't get anything. They just got, the right to be free, but they didn't get compensated for being a slave. Yes. The slave owners were compensated.
The right to wage slavery.
Yeah.
Effectively.
But I mean, the point is that what tends to happen in societies is that the physical infrastructure represents inevitably the interests of the dominant groups within the society. And it only changes very occasionally. And when it does, then people may say, well, we don't want those statues there anymore. We want different statues.
The abolitionists actually are pretty much celebrated in places like the Caribbean, places like Haiti, etc.
Well, exactly.
A lot of these people have got statues there, but no Edward Colston statue.
Yes, and I'm sure that the Edward Colston statue, if there were any in the Caribbean, wouldn't last 5 minutes. But the point is, pulling statues down without any kind of, because there's been some groups that have gone out and pulled other statues down now on the back of what's happened, even though they've got no agreement to take them down. Now that is provocative. Because, some would say, well, you've got no basis to do that. If it's gone through
some vote, that's okay, is it?
Well, the question is, should we have democratic decisions or should mob rule...
Is America a democracy?
No, it's not entirely a democracy, but having people charging around just deciding they don't like the statue, is that good enough as well? Perhaps not, but perhaps somebody should pull down the statue of Lincoln. I don't think they should, but some people might think that they ought to because he was a bad guy in various ways in their view. The IRA blew up Nelson's column in Dublin in 1966. There was a famous song about it. Down came Nelson, and because they were sick of having Nelson's column in the centre of Dublin.
Maybe we'll put a link to that on our show page. That song. Anyway, but Martin, Nancy Pelosi has called for the removal of Confederate statues from the Capitol building, which does seem a bit inflammatory because that is actually nothing to do with the federal government. It's the individual states that choose. They each have something like 2 or 3 statues they're allowed to put there.
Well, I mean, what's happened is that these statues have been made a political issue both by the left and by the right. The right wants to defend the right for them to be there. The left are getting geared up to say they shouldn't be there. And what will probably happen is some will be removed and some won't, and various rows will be had about it. But I think the issue whether statues should or shouldn't be there is a legitimate debate, and we've got to find out what people think about it.
It's a little bit about the control of history, isn't it?
Of course it is. But I mean, there's no point moaning about that. I mean, you could argue that all statues that are in place should never be removed, like Rhodes' statue on Rhodes' House in Oxford. But you might want to put a blue plaque next to it saying, well, in actual fact, modern Oxford University doesn't agree with his imperialist views, but we're not going to remove the statue just for the hell of it. That's one solution. Or you might decide, no, that statue's got to go. But I think that's a legitimate debate. And it's no use people saying, well, all statues that are already there have got to stay. I mean, as you say, there is no statue of Thomas Clarkson, the great hero of abolition in Bristol. Why not? Maybe there should be.
This is your award-winning BCFM. BCFM on 93.2, 24 hours a day.